Hello, everyone. This is Joyce Davis, and I am the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. And I'm happy to be here with you tonight for another one of our great decisions, our great decisions discussion. And tonight's conversation will be one of the most important, I think, in the universe, and that is understanding a little bit better related to the two Koreas. So that is our topic, and we have an expert who's going to share his thoughts and his perspectives with us after we watch our video. And again, we want to thank the Frederickson Library for being a sponsor of our Great Decisions program. We're now into our 6th. We have 2 more that we will be doing in the coming weeks. So now that we have folks joining us, and we know we're watching on Facebook as well as here in the webinar, please relax. I am going to get all the tech started and so that we can watch our video. All right, so stay tuned. When I come back, I'll have with us Frank who is with the United States Institute of Peace, and he is an expert on the Koreas. So stay tuned, and we will be right back after we watch the video.
This is South Korea today, the capital city, Seoul. In some ways as modern, as wicked, as anything in the Western world. Korea today seems like a very distant relative to that once war-ravaged land.
It was a transformation so dramatic that it could only be described as a miracle. When the Korean War ended in 1953, South Korea was impoverished and stagnant. Today, it is the world's 12th largest economy, an incubator of cutting-edge technology, and a potent cultural force. Great Decisions investigates South Korea's rapid development and examines its evolving partnership with the United States. The Korean Peninsula, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
When the Korean director Bong Joon-ho arrived at the Incheon airport, fresh off his dramatic victory at the Academy Awards, a jubilant crowd gathered to applaud a native son.
South Korean public went absolutely crazy. They were so euphoric. They see it as having achieved something very special.
Parasite's critical success was just one more reminder that Korean culture has become a global phenomenon.
The success of Korean cultural exports has really, I think, changed the way that people around the world think about Korea. And it's also made Korea a very desirable place.
Increasingly, as Korean culture gains salience and awareness here in the United States, there's a mutual respect. The Koreans are constantly true to their traditional values, but also mixing, matching, creating, and experimenting.
The ascendance of Korean culture seems all the more remarkable to those who fully appreciate just how far South Korea has come.
I remember it was an omnipresent sight. Beggars on the streets at dinner time, begging for food, carrying tin cans. For South Korea to have achieved the level of freedom and democracy and wealth over the past couple of generations, this truly is a singular feat.
To an American, the free soil of Korea is hallowed ground.
As South Koreans emerged from the devastation of the Korean War, the U.S. stepped in to jumpstart the Korean economy.
The U.S. and ROK entered into a formal alliance arrangement. So this gave South Korea the security space to develop its economy, to develop its domestic political system.
Directly after the Korean War, all the natural resources and industrial factories were located in the north, and South Korea had nothing to rely on but human resources. The aid funds extended by the United States played a crucial role in post-war reconstruction effort.
Steady streams of urgently needed supplies pour into Seoul and other Korean villages and cities. The tools and machines of industry, the fertilizer and equipment needed to restore the land to fertility.
The driving force behind South Korea's modernization was a controversial military dictator named Park Chung-hee. At the height of the Cold War, Park was eager to strengthen his country's bond with the U.S., even when doing so provoked anger at home.
South Korea was a key ally of the United States. The United States needed combat troops, and South Korea from 1965 to 1971 sent 300,000 combat troops to Vietnam.
Some 3,000 ROK troops debarked from their landing craft as reinforcements for Korean soldiery already active in the war. As the regiment continues to troop ashore, the Koreans fall into formation to march along the main street of Kwanong.
Opposition Korean politicians rightfully pointed out that South Korea would be akin to playing the role of mercenary in supporting the U.S. war campaign. And by 1971, you have about $1 billion flowing into the South Korean economy.
South Korea was also able to gain from normalizing relations with Japan, which was able to happen because Park Chung-hee was an authoritarian ruler, and it was a very unpopular decision.
Although Park relied on American support, he was determined to forge his own path when it came to modernizing South Korea's economy.
Park Chung-hee wanted to focus on the development of heavy industry in Korea, and the key heavy industry would be the steel industry. The World Bank thought it would be inefficient. Nevertheless, President Park persisted. He gambled, and that gamble paid off.
We tend to believe markets are always the most efficient. But the Korean government went against market forces. They picked winners. They didn't let competition decide which companies were going to survive.
Park built close partnerships with South Korea's largest companies, family-run conglomerates known as chaebols.
The term chaebol refers to large industrial conglomerates within the Korean economy. A chaebol is a business group where ownership and management are both concentrated within a single family.
Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and SK, those are the four big ones. What makes the chaebol unique from other companies around the world is their sprawl and their size. Most chaebol groups make pretty much everything they can.
The South Korean economic development model is one of the government playing a very aggressive role by subsidizing key strategic industries and colluding with big businesses.
The founder of Samsung, Lee Byung-chul, realized that he could actually build not just a business empire, but the entire nation of South Korea with it.
As South Korea blossomed into an economic powerhouse, American policymakers and business leaders grew frustrated with the protectionist policies that had fueled its development. In 2006, the two countries began the arduous process of negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement.
I was the chief U.S. negotiator for the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. I think there'll be a number of difficult issues, but I don't envision any deal breakers. The goal was to open up our respective markets to each other and to integrate our two economies more closely. Before that time, the U.S. and Korea were basically adversaries. Korea wanted to sell its products all over the world, including to the U.S., while at the same time keeping its market closed.
Almost all free trade agreements are controversial because there's winners and there's losers. In Korea, farmers were deeply opposed to the free trade agreement that would allow in U.S. beef, U.S. rice, U.S. soybeans.
We are against the forcible agreement for free trade between South Korea and the United States, benefiting conglomerates, pro-U.S. officials, and men of influence.
In 2008, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, known by the acronym KORUS, became a flashpoint in American electoral politics.
During the campaign, President Obama was public about how he did not approve of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And so when he took office, he instructed us to go back to the agreement and to renegotiate.
The agreement we're announcing today includes several important improvements and achieves what I believe trade deals must do. In particular, manufacturers of American cars and trucks will have much more access to the Korean market.
A divided Congress finally ratified the renegotiated KORUS agreement in 2011. The deal took effect the following year.
We now are the largest supplier of beef to Korea, and we're now the second largest supplier of pork. U.S. investment in South Korea increased by over 20%, and Korean investment here in the United States increased by over 60%. By any measurement, KORUS has been good for America and has been good for Korea too.
Once Korea completed the negotiations with us, our model became Korea's model. And so when it sat down with other countries around the world, it started to ask for similar things that we asked Korea to do. So in many ways, Korea became a great partner in helping to lift the standards of trade agreements around the world.
But the drama surrounding KORUS was far from over.
Once President Trump got into office, he started to walk back a number of U.S. trade agreements. He claimed the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement was harming American exports such as cars, so he wanted a renegotiation of this.
We have a very bad trade deal with Korea, very, very bad trade deal. It's a deal that, it's incompetent that somebody could have made a deal like that.
Some people were worried that it might cause tensions between the United States and Korea. However, despite these concerns, we approach the negotiations in good faith.
The takeaway for the South Koreans was that President Trump basically needed just enough for him to spin it as a win. South Koreans were pretty happy with the result of the second round of negotiation with President Trump. They didn't feel they gave away too much.
With the swift conclusion of the negotiations for the revision, uncertainty surrounding our free trade agreement has been eliminated. As a result, companies from both countries will now be able to do business under more stable conditions.
The Koreans made some concessions. I think those did make the deal a little bit better for U.S. companies. And I think the Koreans very much want to keep this trade deal intact. And I think U.S. companies want to keep this trade deal intact.
The reality is that the new KORUS changed so little that it didn't need congressional approval. At the end of the day, we have an agreement that looks very similar to what it looked before, but we invested a lot of political capital.
Although American trade with South Korea has grown since KORUS, the U.S. is not its biggest trading partner. South Korea's economic reliance on China puts Seoul in a tenuous position.
China is South Korea's #1 trading partner. China-South Korea trade is more than South Korea, United States, South Korea, Japan trade combined. So while U.S. obviously is still very important to South Korea in terms of economy and trade, it's number two. It's not number one anymore.
There has been a rise in uncertainty resulting from the US-China trade dispute. The Korean economy survives by navigating the global supply chain. If Chinese exports are blocked from entering the United States market, this would inevitably have a negative effect on Korean export to China.
The South Koreans have a saying that they are the shrimp among whales. They find themselves in a pretty tough neighborhood. The Chinese economic relationship looms large in South Korea.
The rivalry between China and the United States has tested the ability of successive Korean governments to craft an independent foreign policy without antagonizing either Beijing or Washington.
The relationship between South Korea and China and South Korea and the United States really puts Seoul in a delicate balancing act. They have to be careful not to go too far to alienate either one of them.
The notion that the US and China can somehow engage in this zero-sum strategic competition without having any major impact on its allies in the region, like South Korea and Japan, is false. And that is why American policymakers really need to pay closer attention to what policymakers in Seoul and Tokyo are saying.
In recent years, the Chinese government has been quick to punish South Korea economically for any behavior it perceives as a threat.
We saw this dynamic with the decision by the United States to deploy THAAD, the Theater High Altitude Air Defense System. It's a missile defense system that President Obama and South Korean President Park decided to deploy in 2016. Now, this was a system that the Chinese objected to quite strenuously, and it put Korea in a very uncomfortable position.
Our missile defense cooperation, THAAD, is a purely defensive system to deter and defend against North Korean threats.
China did not hesitate to bare knuckle pressure South Korea. Suddenly all the group tours of Chinese tourists to South Korea stopped. The very large department store firm found that suddenly no one was coming into its shops. Korean performers going to China for very lucrative tours suddenly couldn't get their visas.
Determined to check China's growing influence around the world, American national security officials from both parties view South Korea as a crucial base from which to pressure Beijing.
I think in responding to China overall in this century, the U.S. needs to do more to have structures in East Asia and South Asia that put military partnerships in a more effective posture.
As the United States pursues what is likely to be a long-term competition with China, our alliances, including Korea, are going to be a critical advantage.
But the military partnership between the U.S. and South Korea has become increasingly strained.
We're defending nations that are very wealthy. South Korea is a very wealthy nation. They make our television sets, they make ships, they make everything.
From the moment he took office, Donald Trump began pressuring South Korea to spend more to offset the cost of basing more than 28,000 American soldiers in the country.
Now they're paying $1 billion a year. And I went to him again. I said, look, I'll be back because that's just a fraction. And again, the relationship is great, but it's just not a fair relationship.
This is another aspect of the purely transactional Trump view of what the deployment of American forces around the world is about. I think that it is almost certainly true that other countries could spend substantially more on their own defense than they do. The problem is, in the Trump view, if they're not paying enough, we'll just come home. I think that's a big mistake.
President Trump views the United States as a mercenary power. He wants to deploy our troops to places only where those nations will pay. Well, that's not why we send troops around the world. Our military is not a money-making operation for the federal government.
This is a very strong alliance we have, but Korea is a wealthy country and could and should pay more to help offset the cost of defense.
The South Koreans are not free riders, not even close. They are an unbelievably productive ally. The United States' largest overseas military base was recently completed, and that cost was around $10 billion, and the Koreans paid between 92 and 96% of those costs.
Within South Korea, President Trump's burden-sharing demands fanned the flames of popular resentment.
If you look at polling, there's only a very, very small minority, single digits of people who are sympathetic to U.S. demands to dramatically increase payments to the United States. The vast majority, over 90% of Koreans, are opposed to a vast increase.
Our country really doesn't need you, Trump. Go back to your country quickly.
The Koreans feel like they've kind of been given a shakedown, and they don't like it. They feel insulted. I think has undercut confidence in the relationship.
Some experts worry that American policymakers are reluctant even to debate the received wisdom that the U.S. must maintain a permanent military presence in East Asia.
That's premised on a particular view of what America should do, which is it should have a ring of forward deployed bases around the world. You could easily make an argument that the U.S. doesn't need any of these bases. But in Washington, D.C., the idea that the United States needs these bases is unquestioned.
What has been missing in Washington is a robust debate. And I think in the case of South Korea, some people have a knee-jerk reaction against even talking about it. They think it's very subversive or dangerous to suggest that U.S. troops should come home from South Korea 70 years after the Korean War.
America is a Pacific power, a resident Pacific power. And we are going nowhere. Nowhere.
We need to have a presence in the Korean Peninsula because if North Korea were to overrun South Korea, that would be a disaster for our own interests, both in that region and all across the world.
We just have that Cold War mentality that says we have to have forward bases. But the reality is our ability to project power from the United States around the globe is really substantial. I've been stationed in Korea. I've fought in 4 different combat environments. My assessment is that we don't need to be there.
Today, analysts paint a picture of a complicated relationship.
The vast majority of the South Korean people remain pro-US. However, paradoxically, outside the Middle East, we see on occasion the highest level of anti-US sentiment and even virulent anti-US protests. Where? In South Korea.
The older generation is grateful, but the folks who don't remember the Korean War or who didn't grow up in poverty, they have a very different view of the United States. They know that the democratization effort was achieved not with the help of the United States, but despite United States backing South Korean authoritarian rule.
There's always going to be some lingering pockets of anti-Americanism, especially when there's a negative incident involving US troops. But it's only a small minority of South Koreans who feel this way. 85% of South Koreans believe that US troops are necessary today.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
American policymakers who respond forcefully to North Korea's provocations must walk a fine line. Millions of South Koreans still dream that reunification might someday be possible.
Particularly with a president like Moon Jae-in in power, there really is a desire of saying, you know, we've waited long enough.
South Korean fans gathered en masse tonight outside the ice hockey arena in Pyeongchang to voice their support for the unified Korean women's ice hockey team, which will take to the ice tomorrow for the first time in Olympic competition.
Win or lose, the result doesn't matter. I hope they play their best with a unified mind, moving toward the reunification.
think Washington's view is keep the pressure on until North Korea comes to the table or to stay in stasis. That's a tension that has been present in a number of administrations in both Seoul and Washington.
President Moon wants to do more to engage aggressively with the North, whereas the United States is a little more cautious. You're always going to have not a perfect alignment between the two allies, but I think that's perfectly natural.
Yet despite the uncertainties in the US-South Korea alliance, leaders in both countries understand that they have tied their nations' fates together.
We share important values like democracy and a market economy. We learn from each other and appreciate each other's contribution. We have a famous saying that a tree with deep root will have many fruits.
Koreans feel increasingly over the years that our shared values are genuine. They want American leadership. Doesn't mean that they think we're perfect. They know we're not. But absent an American voice, absent American values, they think the world is a much more dangerous place.
Nearly 7 decades have passed since South Korea emerged, battered but defiant, from the horrors of an all-consuming war. Since then, ordinary Koreans have continued to battle, to revolutionize their economy, to build a democracy, and to earn respect on the global stage. Now, as Koreans look to the future, they must grapple with vexing questions about how to navigate a dangerous world.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot, which shares their views with Congress.
Well, we are back to begin our discussion today. And you may have noticed Frank as one of the experts that was featured in this film. And we have Frank with us tonight to lead our discussion on the two Koreas. Frank is the senior expert on North Korea at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He oversees the Institute's work on North Korea and focuses on ways to strengthen diplomacy to reduce tensions and enhance peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. From 2010 to 2017, Mr. worked at the Department of Defense, including as special counsel to the Army General Counsel, special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs, and senior advisor on North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Now, during this time, he advised 4 secretaries of defense on issues related to Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. So we have someone who's absolutely qualified and capable of leading our discussion. He's certainly an expert, but more than that, he is interesting. He has a wonderful way of talking about a very difficult and complicated topic. So with that, I'm going to invite Frank to join us. There we go. Let's see. I think we just have to start your video. There you go. There you go.
Hi, Joyce. How are you doing?
I am fine. I'm fine. It's good to have you here with us, and we did see your cameo in the video. So thank you for that.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you and the World Affairs Council in Harrisburg for inviting me to talk about the Korean Peninsula. I'm always hesitant to use that label expert because there's that saying from Walter Mondale that anyone who calls themselves an expert on North Korea is either a liar or a fool, right? I'm trying to figure out what I am.
I hear you. I hear you.
So before I begin, I just wanted to introduce my organization. For those of you who aren't familiar, I work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, or USIP, and we're a national nonpartisan and independent institute that's founded and funded by Congress and also dedicated to preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. Now, the Korean Peninsula is a unique situation because on one hand, it's not in the middle of an active ongoing conflict, like in the case of Afghanistan. On the other hand, the Korean War is technically still not over because the participants in that war only signed a truce rather than a peace treaty. And as we saw recently in 2017, tensions on the Korean Peninsula can periodically rise to dangerous levels where the potential for a military conflict is very real. So my efforts at USIP are focused on both preventing a major conflict on the Korean Peninsula, but also the goal of peace building on the Korean Peninsula. There's so much discussion about denuclearization and arms control or US forces on the peninsula and even sanctions, but there's less thinking in DC on how we can enhance diplomacy and engagement to strengthen mutual understanding and trust between the United States and North Korea. So I want to start here with the first question about why we should care about the Korean Peninsula. You know, I was watching the video and a lot of it seems like such a long time ago, the video in black and white, but a lot of it has personal resonance for me as an American of Korean descent. I was born and raised in California, but my parents immigrated from Korea in the early 1970s, mostly to provide a better life for the family. But some of it was also due to the harsh authoritarian environment in South Korea, and also the opening up of the visa quotas with the Immigration Act of 1965. And also my grandfather on my mother's side went missing during the Korean War. So that's a direct impact from that period on our family. Similarly, there's nearly 2 million other Americans of Korean descent who care about the peninsula because of their existing family ties in South Korea. So they certainly don't want to see a war break out there. And of these Korean Americans, there's tens of thousands who have also have relatives in North Korea and haven't been able to reunite with them because of the poor state of relations between Washington and Pyongyang. I'd also add that there are over 5,300 US soldiers from the Korean War who are unaccounted for in North Korea. And I'm sure their family members are eager for better relations between the two countries so that the remains of these soldiers can be repatriated back to America. But beyond these direct familial ties, why should the rest of America care about the Korean Peninsula? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Korean War is technically not over, and the potential for military conflict is still palpable. Some people may argue, well, would we really go to war with North Korea? We might think that, North Korea would never attack us or our ally South Korea because they know that it would mean their immediate destruction. And similarly, we would never attack North Korea because they could retaliate against our allies or us as well, right? But things don't work out that neatly in real life. We've seen in recent years that the US is willing to engage in direct military action against another country when we think it's in our national security interest. We saw this with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Quds Force in 2020. We saw this with the US missile attack on the Syrian air base in 2017. And there are many times over the last 30 years, once in 1994 and also in 2017, where there was actual potential for US strikes in North Korea due to their growing nuclear program. And then vice versa, North Korea, while it hasn't taken direct action against US forces for many years, it has taken aggressive action against our ally, South Korea, including sinking a South Korean ship and launching artillery fires against a South Korean island, both happening in 2010. And then, of course, North Korea has conducted cyber attacks against the US, including the 2014 hack of Sony Pictures Entertainment. right? So there is a greater than 0% chance that a small incident like these could occur. And then a small provocation could later escalate into a greater conflict, especially with a country like North Korea, where we have no diplomatic relations, there's poor communication channels, no mutual trust, and both sides feeling like they have to demonstrate dominance over the other to deter future aggression. Some military analysts even believe that North Korea could feel forced into a quote unquote use it or lose it scenario where they have to use their nuclear weapons first because they might lose the opportunity if the US wages a wide-scale military attack to prevent North Korea from using their weapons, right? So the potential loss of life on the Korean Peninsula and elsewhere would be catastrophic. There are 75 million people who live on the peninsula, as well as more than 200,000 Americans. On top of the human casualties is the economic impact. So South Korea is the 11th largest economy in the world and the 6th largest trading partner for the United States. Not only that, think about the neighboring countries that have a direct stake on the peninsula: Japan, China, Russia. These countries have some of the largest economies and militaries in the world. So the impact of a war on the Korean Peninsula would be absolutely devastating. So here I want to shift to what I think are the major issues on the Korean Peninsula. And the first issue is North Korea. So currently, the Biden administration is conducting a review of its North Korea policy, but there is growing concern among experts about the continuation of a policy that uses pressure and isolation to get North Korea to come back to the negotiating table on the US's preferred terms. In my opinion, I think this type of coercive policy is problematic because it relies on two faulty assumptions. One is that pressure will work on North Korea, and two is that China is willing to help the United States to enforce this pressure policy against North Korea. But we've seen over many years that the opposite is true, which is that North Korea and China respond to pressure not by rolling over, but by retaliating with its own pressure. And then also, China has no interest in enforcing sanctions against North Korea and destabilizing its neighbor ally. And I think the results of the pressure policy support my argument. So the 6-year period from 2012 to 2018, which was the longest period over the last 30 years in which the United States did not engage with North Korea and instead it applied pressure, this period saw the biggest advancements in North Korea's nuclear weapons program, including 4 nuclear tests of progressively greater yield and over 80 ballistic missile tests, including some at intercontinental ranges. On the flip side is that when we do engage with North Korea, we've seen some tangible benefits to security. So for example, in the early 1990s, there was the bilateral agreed framework deal between the two countries. And while it wasn't perfect, it did lead to a halt in plutonium reprocessing at North Korea's Yongbyon facility for 8 years, without which it could have produced enough fissile material for over 100 nuclear weapons. So we'll see over the next few months where the Biden administration comes down on its North Korea policy. The second issue I want to address is US relations with our ally, South Korea. It's been pretty rocky over the last few years. President Trump had an anti-alliance, America first stance. He called South Korea freeloaders, and he threatened to pull US troops out of South Korea if they didn't pay more for troop stationing costs. Now, it looks like the Biden administration will be returning back to a more conventional position that values our alliances and works with our allies to address common security threats. And recently, the two countries came to a quick agreement on cost sharing, which resolved the friction point that had been plaguing the alliance over the last several years. But there are still tensions ahead. The two sides don't see eye to eye on North Korea policy. President Moon wants to pursue a more aggressive engagement approach, while Biden, as I mentioned earlier, will probably be a little more cautious and focus on using pressure. Also, the US wants South Korea to be a stronger participant in its efforts to establish a free and open Indo-Pacific, while South Korea is very wary about joining any efforts that appears to be ganging up on China, especially because of how reliant the South Korean economy is on China. And then the last big issue I'll raise is the ongoing tensions between South Korea and Japan. Their bilateral relations have reached their lowest point in decades, with current tensions undermining political, security, economic, and cultural ties. Under the Trump administration, Washington made little effort to facilitate improvement in South Korea-Japan relations. We'll probably see a more engaged effort under the Biden administration to strengthen bilateral and trilateral ties, especially given the value it places on alliances. Also, Secretary of State Blinken was very instrumental in having trilateral US, South Korea, Japan meetings during his time as the Deputy Secretary of State under the Obama administration. So I see him continuing that effort as well. So I'll stop there, and then we can probably take some questions.
Well, that was a very concise overview, I think, of the issues we're dealing with. So thank you for that. And I think you have definitely made the case of why we need to pay attention to what's going on the Korean Peninsula. But I want to talk to you, because this is, I'm sure, on the minds of lots of people. How much damage or benefit did Trump's policies do? And let's start when we talk about North Korea first. We're emerging from a time when it looked like what he was doing was working, right? I mean, there was a love relationship. They were best buds. What did that produce? Did it produce anything? Did it hurt? Did it help?
Well, I think the bottom line is that we are back at square one, right? So I think there's an argument to be made that despite all the summits, all the letters that were shared between the two leaders, we haven't moved one step forward in denuclearizing North Korea or improving relations. So from that perspective, not a whole lot of benefit. That being said, I do want to credit President Trump a little bit with some of the unconventional tactics that he used to try to improve relations, right? So one is being willing to meet directly with Kim Jong-un. This is the first time in the history of basically over the last 70 years in which a US sitting president met with the North Korean leader, right? And because North Korea's system is top down, they can't make any decisions without getting the green light from the leader. That was a theory worth trying, right? Talking directly with their leader. Another thing that President Trump did was to take some unilateral confidence building measures, including suspending joint military exercises right off the bat. So I think the way he did it, he didn't consult with President Moon of South Korea when he did that, but still it was a display of immediate confident action. I think I wish he would have consulted with South Korea first, but I think ultimately it's a move that President Moon would have supported, to suspend military exercises to promote the diplomatic process that was going on, right? And then lastly, there was the sort of the approach that the special representative for North Korea policy under Trump, Steve Biegun, announced, which was this process of looking at peace and denuclearization at the same time. So previously in the past, US policy has always been to try to seize denuclearization first before we're willing to talk about peace with North Korea. But Biegun announced that, hey, we're gonna look at these two issues simultaneously. And I think that is an approach that was supported by many North Korea watchers. So I think all of those tactics, very unconventional, were very helpful. The problem was that it was undermined by a very incoherent, inconsistent approach from the Trump administration overall. Because on one hand, you had President Trump who was talking in very dulcet tones, oftentimes praising Kim Jong-un. On the other hand, you had his advisors like John Bolton, Secretary of State Pompeo, talking in very harsh, hardline terms about North Korea needing to denuclearize first before we would take any steps. So it was a very incoherent, inconsistent policy. And I think North Korea got frustrated by that. So overall, I think there were some interesting tactics that were deployed. But again, the bottom line is that we're back at where we started.
Yeah, it certainly was unconventional. And I will say, for just the people who are observing, it looked like tensions were being reduced. Who knew that you could do this and have things get better, right? I mean, right. But the other question that I wonder now, did we give away too much? I know you said the meeting was good, that it was good that he tried this unconventional way, but where does that now leave the United States and Biden? If they're trying to make inroads, does he have to do another grand summit where he exchanges love letters? Or, I mean, where does this leave US diplomacy?
That's a good question. I think some people would argue that we set this precedent, right? Yeah. We set expectations for Kim Jong-un, where now he feels like he can only engage at the leader level, and maybe that might undermine our ability to start with working level negotiations, right? I can see some validity in that. At the same time, the Biden administration has already expressed that they are not willing to meet at the leader level until there is progress on denuclearization, and it seems like that leader level summit meeting is warranted, right? So I think we may need to try to find a balance where we start off with working level discussions, but with the promise that if there is some success in diplomatic negotiations and denuclearization, then President Biden would be willing to meet. So yeah. I think
the North wants that. Do you think Kim Jong-un would like a meeting now with Biden? He wants to keep this kind of relationship going?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do it
anymore? No, I think he would be willing to, North Korea would be willing to engage again. But again, they are frustrated because they feel like they put a lot on the table back in 2018 and it wasn't reciprocated by the US. So providing the moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile tests, offering to dismantle their nuclear test site at Punggye-ri, their missile engine test site at Dongchangni, and then the delivery of the 55 boxes of US service member remains. So these are all the things that North Korea offered. They felt like they didn't get anything back from the United States except the suspension of military exercises in August 2018. But beyond that, remember when Secretary Pompeo met with Kim Jong-un, this is 1 month after Singapore in 2018, June 2018, and they accused Secretary Pompeo of making gangster-like demands, which is only making demands of the US without coming prepared with our own concessions. So again, I think North Korea is willing to see what the Biden administration will offer. Again, we're undergoing a review of North Korea policy right now, but at a certain point, I think North Korea will get a little antsy and may do something to demonstrate its impatience, right? And that's the concern.
Right. We'll come back to talking about North Korea because that's, of course, that's the fascinating thing for many Americans. But let's talk about South Korea now. And again, we look back to set the context for where we are now. The relationship between two allies, right, seemed strained. And as we saw, many, especially the younger South Koreans, didn't take well to bullying. Right. And so I'm wondering, as you look back at that, how much damage was done? Maybe the older generation was willing to overlook it, but the younger people clearly were insulted, right? Or was everybody insulted? I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly during the Trump administration, as we saw during the video, there was significant offense taken by President Trump's words when he called South Korea freeloader. I think there was also an instance maybe at a Republican conference where he called the South Korean people terrible. So the people took offense at that, and they felt like they weren't being appreciated in terms of their contributions to the alliance. That being said, I think survey data shows that that's not a permanent feeling. So there's still very strong support among the South Korean population for the alliance, for US troop presence, for US bases in South Korea. But I think there may be some worry that someone like President Trump, who doesn't value the alliance relationship, may come back. It may not be President Trump himself, but it could be someone else who has more of an isolationist America first stance that could reemerge. But I think overall, there's still very strong support for the alliance and what the US military provides.
And were they subject to any tariffs? I don't remember. If all of this tariff war, did that affect South Korea at all? Did Trump put any tariffs on their products?
Yeah, but again, recognize that there was the video referred to the Korea's free trade agreement and President Trump's feelings that it was a very bad deal for the United States. But the deal that the new free trade agreement deal that the United States negotiated with South Korea wasn't all that different from the original Korea's free trade agreement. It was just sort of like taking one product and wrapping it up in a new bow and saying, ta-da, this is a new deal, right? But I think that's why South Korea is basically happy with that deal, because they recognize it's not all that different, but it allows President Trump to claim a victory. But overall, the alliance relationship is maintained.
Absolutely. Well, so basically, we're still strong trading partners, and yet, as we saw from that chart that was there, China is by far the more powerful and the more important partner for South Korea. So I guess the next question is, as these tensions continue between the United States and China, what kind of policies do you see South Korea doing to try to keep friends with both of these giants?
Right. South Korea is in a very difficult position, and it's been something that we've been used to historically, right? Being what Ambassador Mark Lippert referred to. He was paraphrasing the South Korean phrase about being a shrimp among whales, right?
Yeah.
And so South Korea is used to this. They know how to balance between larger powers. They see the United States as the main security provider. They have the military alliance with the US, but they also recognize the importance of the economic relationship, because I think about 27% of South Korean exports are to China. So China is the largest trading partner for South Korea. And so they have to balance that, right? So when it comes to military issues, they work strongly with the United States because of the alliance, but also when it comes to the economy, they feel like they need to tread that line very carefully because of potential retaliation. We saw that in the video back in, I think, around 2014, when South Korea accepted the deployment of the US THAAD missile defense system. China retaliated economically, shutting off South Korean tourism, shutting down the South Korean department stores in China, and making it life very difficult for South Korea. And they don't want that to happen again. And so we're seeing this issue come up again in terms of the Quad mechanism and the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. South Korea is very hesitant to join that wholeheartedly. And so what they're trying to do is recognize that there is a lot of overlap in South Korea's values with the Quad and with the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. But what they're doing is they announced a new Southern policy, which is their way to interact with ASEAN states and India and say, we're going to promote these values. And there's a lot of overlap with the free and open Indo-Pacific, but it's not the same thing, because we're not going to do anything that excludes China or makes it seem like we're targeting the relationship with China.
Got it. Well, before we ask you to kind of sum up and look ahead and give us the vision for where you think things will go, I really want to delve in a little bit into this issue of American troops in Korea. So we heard discussions. In fact, one guy put it bluntly, there's no reason for them to be there. So talk a little bit about that. And if indeed, because clearly there's a lot of Americans who believe, let's bring our troops home, let's save that money. Why are we all over the world? Would you explain your position on that and whether you think the Biden administration may be rethinking this?
Well, I think that's a pretty complicated topic, and it gets at the question of what is the purpose of our forward deployed defense posture across the world? And I can think of at least 3 points. The first one is deterrence, right? What type of military presence do we need in Korea to deter aggression from North Korea? Some people would argue that South Korea, which already has a very capable and advanced military, can deter conventional attacks from North Korea on its own, and that the US can provide extended nuclear deterrence from outside the peninsula through its triad of bombers, ground-based missiles, and submarines. So given all this, there should be a way to reduce the number of US ground troops in South Korea. On the other hand, others would argue that reducing the number of US troops on the Korean Peninsula would only send a bad message to North Korea, implying that our commitment to deterrence is decreasing, right? Mm-hmm. The second point I can think of is the other side of the coin to deterrence, which is reassurance. So South Korea has long had fears about US abandonment, and any hint of US withdrawal, even if it's just a partial withdrawal, is worrisome to many, particularly those on the right in South Korea. South Koreans across the political spectrum, like I said before, they support the US-South Korea alliance. Their approval ratings are consistently in the 90% range, and they also support long-term US troop presence as long as North Korea still remains a threat. So to make sure that our allies are reassured about the US commitment to its defense, any modifications to US troop presence would probably need to be done in consultation with Seoul and probably in an incremental fashion. Otherwise, you could potentially elicit a drastic response from Seoul, including developing its own indigenous nuclear weapons, right?
Right.
And then the last point I'd raise, in addition to deterrence and reassurance, is our broader power projection capability. So for many decades, the US has been focused on having its forces geographically dispersed so that it can not only deter adversaries and reassure allies, but also have the ability to respond quickly to crises abroad. So if our forces were stationed at or closer to home, it'd be very expensive to have to move our forces into the theater every time there's a contingency, whether it's a military conflict or even things like humanitarian assistance operations or disaster relief. In addition, it's cheaper to station our forces abroad because our allies are willing to share in the cost of stationing troops there, right? So there's an economic and strategic argument for maintaining a forward deployed presence. The issue for many, however, is that there's a trade-off and that this presence abroad comes at the expense of investing in our people and infrastructure at home. So there's arguments to be made.
So one argument is that it's cheaper to be stationed there than to have to bring your troops there every time there's a problem, right? That it's really economically efficient to have troops stationed there. But yes. I want to ask you about that second point. Is there a generational divide in whether Koreans want troops to remain there? Do the older people want them there and the young people say, no, get out? I heard that young man saying, go home, Trump, right?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a divide. Obviously, the older generation remember the Korean War and they place a value on the US military more so than the younger generation. That being said, I think across the spectrum, you still see broad-based support for US troops. Again, it depends on the context. So I think if the North Korean threat was over, then you'd see less support. And certainly there's more support again, as I said, in the older generation. But across the board, I think whether it's from 60% to 80%, you still see support for U.S. forces.
I see. Okay. So again, we've spent a whole lot of time talking about the economics and about the military and security and North Korea and the bomb and all of that. But we really did miss one aspect, and that is the tremendous influence that Korean culture has. The music. They did start with the film director, actually winning right here in the U.S. So do you want to share a little bit about the vibrancy of the Korean cultural scene, the youth, the music? Yeah.
Right. I feel as I get older, it's hard for me to accurately reflect the vibrancy and dynamism of the South Korean entertainment pop industry. I remember, I loved Korean pop music from the 90s, and I feel like that's a lot better than the music I hear these days. But that's absolutely right. It's called Hallyu, right? So the Korean wave of pop music that's become very popular. I think from the 90s, but I think more so in the current consciousness, people probably refer to Psy and the Gangnam Style dance that was very popular in 2012. Now that people refer to BTS and some of the more modern Korean bands that we've seen on stage. But this is not just music. It's the entertainment industry, very strong. Like you referred, Bong Joon-ho won his Parasite film, won the Best Picture at the Academy Awards last year. Not only that, Korean food is very popular. Now there's no menu in the US where you don't see kimchi on the menu or some variation of kimchi, right? That started, I think, in the mid 2000s, but it's getting more and more popular. A lot of it is actually derived from or stems from a conservative effort by the South Korean government. They're doing a very good job of public diplomacy, of selling its culture, the soft power, food, music, entertainment, movies. And so I think more and more we'll see more impact from South Korea. But also it's on the flip side is the Korean American generation, right? So it's not just South Korean influence from abroad, but there's 2 million Korean Americans in the US. A lot of the top chefs right now, David Chang, Hooni Kim, Corey Lee, these are Korean, they're not Koreans, they're Korean Americans, right? And they're having a big role as well. And we're gonna see more and more of that in the future.
Well, very good. Listen, before I let you go, we just have a few, I did see some questions come in and I want to just throw these at you so we won't ignore our audience here. But one person is asking, how much does the US military contribute to the South Korean economy? Is it a lot? Is it significant?
I don't know the exact numbers. I'm sure around the bases, there's a lot of contributions. I mean, you have tens of thousands of US troops and their family members living in Seoul, living in Pyeongchang. And so there's going to be these industries and businesses that revolve around the bases, right? Whether it's something like bars or food, but also, on the negative side, there's, of course, the concerns about prostitution that has been plaguing military bases for a long time. But there is some contribution to the Korean economy by their presence.
And one other, the question is the US role in defending South Korea, but doesn't China have an interest in protecting South Korea? I mean, it's its own interest to keep North Korea, kind of contained, right?
Right. So China is very concerned about its neighbor, and their approach to the peninsula is that they do not want to see any instability. They don't want to see any war, and they don't want to have North Korea maintain its nuclear weapons. But it's prioritized in that order. So they want to make sure that there's no war or instability first, right?
Right.
And then they'll worry about the nuclear weapons. So that's why they want to make sure that they push North Korea to denuclearize, but not to the point where they cause instability, say, for example, by enforcing sanctions so harshly that the regime collapses and then you have mass flow of refugees from North Korea into China, causing a lot of problems at their borders. So China is very much concerned about stability, but they have to approach it in their own right way.
Okay, and we saved the hardest question for last, the final question. A pastor is asking, how important is religion in South Korea, at least? How important is it?
You know, I have to admit, I don't know the specific numbers. Certainly, there's a very strong Christian population, also Buddhist as well. I'm more familiar in the Korean American community where, you know, there's a huge influence, much like the Black community of the church as the center of social life. I'm not, but that's more of an immigrant story because, you know, when you come here, you need to find that center for where you get involved in a new society, right? In South Korea, I didn't grow up there, so I don't know exactly, but there is, you know, a lot of churches and they have their own different roles in the strength of in politics and in supporting different political parties. But I don't want to speak too much on that because I'm not expert on it.
I got it. Well, listen, you have proven you are an expert. You have led us on a really lively discussion of a very important topic for us. So I want to thank you. And I also want to underscore what you said about the United States Institute of Peace. A few years back, I was a fellow there and wrote my first book. So I know what a wonderful institution it is, and one that I don't think many people know really does advance and study peacemaking around the world. So
I do want to add, just as a closing point, now you mentioned USIP. So for those of you who are interested in following USIP's work more closely after today, I encourage you to follow us on social media and go to our website at usip.org to sign up for our email newsletter, tune in for webcasts and virtual events, and you can also find our entire catalog of online courses on conflict resolution and peace building.
I just put usip.org there in the chat thing, but it's easy, just United States Institute of Peace. And again, thank you so much. This has been thoroughly enjoyable and enlightening. So with that, enjoy the rest of your evening and say hello to all our friends at USIP.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, Harrisburg.
All right.